Okay, great. I'm Valerie Insinna. I am the Congress and Defense Industry Reporter for Breaking Defense. You guys are not here to hear from me. You guys are here to hear from them. So I'm going to get very quickly to my esteemed panelists, my wonderful panelists. Sitting right beside me, to my direct left, we have Admiral Jacoby. He is the Deputy Commandant for Systems and the Chief Acquisition Executive for the Coast Guard. In the middle, we have Pat Kelleher, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of War for Materiel Readiness. And then all the way at the end over there, we have Dr. Ramdass, the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of War for Industrial Base Policy. Thank you guys for being here with us. I'm so excited to chat about one of my favorite topics in the entire world, acquisition reform, speeding up the acquisition process. I'm so happy that you guys could be here today. So to start things off, I thought, I could have each of you give me one example of how the acquisition reform pieces that we've seen, obviously DoD has done their internal process. There were many changes enabled by the NDAA. Sir Admiral, you're outside of the DoD, but DHS is moving very quickly too now. How is the environment changing to enable you to do things quicker, more efficiently? And essentially, how are you getting things quicker to troops that need them?
I would love to start.
Yeah.
I actually am very excited about acquisition reform and speed to delivery. So not a joke, that's where I've spent my career. Either in the engineering side or the acquisition side. I would want to start, you mentioned I'm the Deputy Commandant for Systems. That's a brand new position in the Coast Guard. And it ties into your question of how the Coast Guard is executing acquisitions faster and getting capability to the fleet. We looked at how we would do that, and we concluded that it's not just receiving the funding that we need, which we were in a readiness crisis, unable to fund acquisition and sustainment of our ships, aircraft, C-5 systems. But it wasn't just the funding. We had to reorganize the whole Coast Guard in order to execute faster. So that's where we created this Deputy Commandant for Systems that brings together acquisition and sustainment, engineering and contracting, all under one directorate. So we have life cycle management of our assets now. That's one piece. The third piece we needed, so funding, organizational change, and a whole lot of policy change. We are under the FAR. We have our acquisition regulations, but there was lots of room to move inside the federal acquisition regulations, and we have changed pretty much everything about the contracting process. Couple examples. Our requirements documents used to be 200 pages, and I counted you needed 27 signatures on a operational requirements document. And we've executed 2 major ship construction type programs with a 1-page requirements document with 7 key performance parameters. And we found you don't need the 200 pages. You can execute off high-level requirements. I'll stop there, but there's lots to dig into in those 3 categories.
I just want to jump in immediately with a question for that, though. With simplifying things so much, I would imagine that potentially, in the best case scenario, that also enables industry to kind of come at you with ideas that you wouldn't necessarily have thought of yourself.
It does, and the Coast Guard is fortunate. We're moving toward FAR Part 12 acquisitions, where we're doing commercial solutions. So several of our recent contracts, a 1-page requirements document, industry comes with a solution, a FAR Part 12 contract, and you can move those in about 30, 45 days. As opposed to, many of our shipbuilding programs, we spent 2 years doing the requirements and putting out competitive solicitations, and we've had several examples of moving literally in 31 days to get contracts awarded.
Awesome. Well, Pat, want to move over to you, ask you sort of the same broad question. Where are the acquisition reform changes? Where are they helping you in the sustainment side of things?
Yeah, no, it's a good question because I think you by its definition, by its name, you default to the acquisition side of the sustainment process because obviously it's the acquisition transformation strategy. But really for us, I think it's done a couple things. Aside from what is being done in terms of accelerating acquisition, but really for us, it's enabled and really empowered a prioritization of how we are applying resources to maintain legacy platforms. So woven throughout the strategy is the need to balance modernization and sustainment. And so then if you look at the model that the department has already developed in terms of prioritizing how we are acquiring munitions, we've applied or are going to soon apply that same approach to prioritize weapon systems. And so that we can, within the context of balancing modernization and sustainment, providing the department a framework to guide investment between maintaining legacy platforms, those that are on the priority list, and we are going to publish a list of priority weapon systems for the Department of War to provide a framework for future investment, and those that are not. And so that will, it's not going to be directive, it's not prescriptive, but it just like we are prioritizing certain munitions to purchase, if we're focusing on LRASMs, it doesn't mean we're not purchasing hand grenades. And so if we're prioritizing systems like HIMARS, it doesn't mean we're not going to invest in things like Humvees, but it's providing an investment framework to guide sort of where you put the next marginal dollar. The next thing that I would say it's doing for us is enabling, enable us to operationalize our application of data. And so we're doing that in two ways. Really how we are assessing the readiness of weapon systems, and then how we are assessing the performance and capacity of the department's maintenance capabilities. And that includes the organic industrial base, but also organic maintenance capacity at echelon. So from the tactical to the strategic, so that we can understand, as you balance between modernization and sustainment, you can understand where your gaps and seams are in terms of maintenance capability, and then obviously couple that with a deeper understanding of supply chain.
I got to ask about the priority list. Can you give us any of the top items, or give a little bit of an idea about, are there types of technologies that have risen to the top, or the rationale that kind of informs that list in terms of ranking those priorities?
No.
No?
I can't.
I guess I'll wait with everyone else.
It really focuses on legacy platforms, I'll tell you that. And it focuses on the platforms that we can all read about that we need to fight and win. And so, as we work through the details of what's going to, and of course there's going to be some healthy debate about, what's on the list, what's off the list, what should be on the list, what should be off. All that debate is going to take place in the next month or so. And so, that's an evolving conversation, I would say.
Awesome.
Just
Vic.
leave it there.
Vic, over to you.
Thanks. There's no better time to be in industrial-based policy. It's really exciting. It seems like it's the term du jour, but more importantly, it is a nexus for much of what we're doing. But the conversation that you had, Valerie, here earlier, or with Pat, really drives to what I think is very systemic and foundational, and we must recognize. So the focus has always been, right, on the major end item. I think, back to your first question, there's a recognition in the department, and it starts all the way from the top, right? So if you think from just a leadership perspective, having the EOs that give us the top cover to really drive a sense of urgency and change, that's what we've been doing in the department, right? Recognizing the problem is much broader than the major end item that everyone seems to center around and everyone focuses on. But look deeper into the supply chain, map that value chain, look at eaches. So if you think of things like critical minerals, for example, you heard the previous panel earlier talking about yttrium and a couple of the other things like that. Tantalum, a number of these, germanium, antimony, rare earths, heavy earths. This is the first time I was actually thrown out of briefings on budgets, trying to justify critical minerals investments in the past. But today, not only there's a recognition, but we're actually putting money after those systemic problems that's plagued the department for multiple decades. So finally, we have historic investments that's really getting after this. And I got to tell you, it's a game changer.
Yeah, I mean, having money definitely does change things. Are there certain policies that are help compounding that change that you can point to as well, or is it mostly resourcing you think that's making the big difference there?
It's resourcing, but also really getting after some of the barriers. So contractually, right? And there might be contracting officers in here, but there's a lot of copy and pasting, right? So contracts, same language, no willingness to change, nothing. No impetus to really break down some of those barriers. We're doing that today. We're leveraging more OTAs for other transactional authorities. So if you look at from the defense industrial base perspective at our DPA and industrial base analysis sustainment funds, we have OTAs for both of those, the dipconsortium.org. If you want to go there for DPA, we have the Cornerstone for IBAS, and that's what's driving and really enabled the department to really invest very quickly and get after some of these challenges.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, if I could add to what Vic says, I mean, one of the great things about working with Vic and the industrial base policy team is that the transformation strategy drives you to a continuum. And in partnership, we have a continuum between the organic industrial base and the manufacturing and industrial capacity that we're responsible for in my office with the manufacturing and industrial capacity that Vic is responsible for, and really synergizing both of those so that we have a more deliberate approach to how we are balancing that continuum and where we are making where we are making investments to achieve the highest readiness return for the department. So it's really a great partnership, and one of the nice things. I mean, it wasn't necessarily a barrier per se before, but it's certainly become a super energized partnership when you talk about the defense industrial base and its two components: the commercial industrial base and the organic industrial base.
Well, one thing that I wanted to hit on that Vic mentioned was the executive order that came from the White House a couple months ago. I don't think that I've ever seen, for as long as I've been covering defense, the White House, the president himself, get so involved in defense acquisition. I mean, obviously, last Friday we just, saw him meet with the heads of some of the top defense companies. And there is this emphasis, of course, on speed and in investment, in modernizing facilities, in internal research and development. I wonder, for all of you guys, where you're sitting, how has the relationship with industry changed? What are you hearing from them?
There's been a large shift in the Coast Guard. The executive orders and the emphasis on shipbuilding or national industrial base or just moving at speed has allowed us to be very bold. We had the Commandant document our ranked priorities in major acquisitions, and the Commandant laid out schedule is the top priority, followed by cost, followed by performance. And we hadn't written it down before, but I think if you had asked before, it would have been performance followed by cost, and we would always trade schedule to get that performance. And we would trade time, we would trade money, and it would take years to get a program in place. So the Commandant laying out those priorities allows the whole acquisition community to line up behind that and get capability out to the fleet. That's where we've been able to push into commercial acquisitions, which are great for schedule, or good for cost. And if it doesn't get all your performance, you circle back and you do another one to fill in the performance gaps. So just laying the groundwork and putting a little pressure and allowing acquisition to move fast has allowed us across all the domains to kind of break down the barriers of we need to wait and get this perfect bespoke solution. We've been able to go and find a design, find a industry partner, put them together, and move very fast.
Pat, what about you?
I would say, probably simply put, there's a greater recognition. I mean, it's always been there, but I think a greater recognition that we're in this together. That this is truly a partnership, and that the only way we can get to, meaningful solutions in the near term is really partnering and collaborating. And understand commercial industry has to make money. That is their purpose. But we have to hold industry accountable. And I think I think it's a very positive environment, fostering really beneficial partnerships and collaborations.
Okay. Vic, what about you?
Yeah, the DEOs give the focus. It really opened the doors to industry. So industrial-based policy, we not only focus on the primes, but also our Office of Small Business Programs really look into the small businesses. We have the Apex accelerators that's embedded in 50 states, 97 different locations, and 300 different sites broadly in the nation. So if you're a small business and you really want to get to work with industrial-based policy, I encourage you to get onto a small business site and reach out. But more importantly, what I've seen is an increased frequency in those conversations taking place with industry. But it's not only the conversation and in terms of more of the same, what the challenges are, et cetera. But what are you going to do about it, right? At the highest level in the department. And the fact that you have that conversation, it's a hard conversation. Let's recognize that right up front, right? Pat mentioned for profit versus the focus in the Department of National Security. But those conversations, those tough conversations are taking place. And guess what? Industry is actually delivering. So I think we've always been told communicate, communicate, communicate. We're doing so, and I see the results. I could see it every day in terms of recently, if you look at the L3 Harris solid rocket motor investment, that was a very deliberate conversation, $1.2 billion. We went from 3 solid rocket motor producers to today we have 12 with non-traditionals in that space. I think those are results that we'll see more of going forward.
Excellent. Well, since you brought up the L3 solid rocket motors investment, I would love to dive into that and kind of get into some individual questions with you guys. So Vic, let's actually start with you. That is, something I think that hasn't really been seen before. The department making direct investments in businesses in that way, as in becoming a holder of equity in one of their defense contractors. Can you kind of walk us through, why that decision was made? What does that give the department? And, is there going to be more deals like this coming up in the future?
So fundamentally, part of the acquisition transformation strategy and the memo signed by the Secretary of War directs us to really work directly with suppliers if we believe there's benefits there. As I alluded to earlier, the conversations we've had, even at the primes, often there's a muddling of messaging or muddling of communication that takes place. It's natural. But I think when you have those direct conversations, and at the end of the day, this is about problem solving. This is really getting back at what are the department's requirements, and how are we organizing and posturing for us to really deliver on results. And that's what we're doing, right? We have done the value chain analysis for many of the critical minerals I mentioned, but solid rocket motors, for example, right? Ukraine, if you look at what we did in Ukraine, and Pat and I and a couple of others supported Ukraine previously, you know there's all solid rocket motors aren't created equal, right? So their uniqueness to that, and thus it drives that conversation with industry, with suppliers, and recognizing that we have to go after second sources. We can't depend on a single source to get after that at a scale and speed at which we're trying to get after.
Got you. Okay, Pat, question for you. Talk to me a little bit about what the Pentagon is doing to ensure that it has tech data across its supply chain for sustainment. I mean, when you think about sustaining some of these legacy weapon systems, those contracts were made long ago, not with the same emphasis on tech data rights as there is now. So can you talk a little bit about what is being done to ensure that that data is gained as much as possible?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question because there's an awful lot going on, whether you in the right to repair or, as Admiral Commandant says, freedom to fix our legacy equipment. It's been around, generations now. Many of the parts we find ourselves having to fix or repair were never designed to be fixed or repaired. When the widget breaks, nobody thought the widget would break, and it's been 37 years since anyone made it anyway. And so there are challenges with technical data and intellectual property. But I think there's two sides to that. Yes, we are working to be more aggressive in making sure that we, the government, can obtain and use the technical data that we need to maintain our legacy platforms. I think sometimes when we talk about challenges, a lot of times it's the government, not asking the right question and not enabling industry to any maneuver space. It's sort of an all or nothing approach. I want it all, and I want it now, and I want it free. Well, that's not really a legitimate. I mean, I'm obviously oversimplifying, but I think what we're learning that we, the department, we need to ask the right questions so that we can get the right level of technical data. I mean, we don't need general purpose rights in perpetuity for the thing. Maybe we need to have limited use rights so that we can manufacture a limited number of parts. And we're working on developing that, what I would call the Spotify model of technical data. So I can buy it, use it for a certain number of, to make a certain number of widgets. We have a system for for transparency with regard to how many widgets that we have produced. And then we pay for them. And I think when you look at it from that perspective, it's a little bit easier. But sometimes we, the government, also, I think we could do a better job researching, diving into the actual ownership of the technical data. I mean, patents expire after 20 years. I think sometimes we can do a better job there. But there are challenges, and there is an awful lot of focus, and I think a better mutual understanding that we have to find an effective middle ground between what the department needs to maintain legacy platforms and be fair and reasonable to those companies that actually still maintain proprietary interest in that data. And so we should pay for that to the degree that it is necessary, fair, and reasonable. We're in the process now of developing a mechanism to sort of track and manage the totality of those kinds of challenges when they arise. But it's almost, I think it's almost the case where we are addressing them almost case by case, where we have a thing, we need to fix the thing. We'll go to the prime and find maybe either a commercial solution or understand with the right level of specificity what exactly it is we need to own to break open the box to fix the thing. And so I think we're making we're making progress.
Any recent successes you can kind of point to?
Well, I'll tell you that we're doing a couple very specific deep dives. So we're teeing them up as case studies that are still we haven't they're underway, and really using them as what I think will be models for how we can address these things on a more deliberate, process-oriented, case-by-case basis. And so I think we'll start to chalk up wins relatively quickly once we have a better understanding of how we can address them sort of on a case-by-case basis.
Awesome. Admiral, okay, so Coast Guard got $25 billion as part of last year's reconciliation bill. You guys have already started spending on that, billions towards Arctic security cutters. What policy changes enabled you to start spending that money quickly? And then can you walk us through what's left of that $25 billion and where that's going to be executed? Because I know that the Coast Guard wants to do that quite quickly. I think I heard by the beginning of next calendar year, which is quite quick.
End of this calendar year, yes. So as of today, we've obligated $8.5 billion of the 25 billion. And I have committed to obligating, over 85% of that by the end of the calendar year. And I mean, truthfully, some of those were existing contracts with options. So there were different levels of complexity. Some were brand new requirements. Some were shore construction, which is traditionally very hard to fast track. But it spans multiple ship programs from icebreakers to offshore patrol cutters, fast response cutters, inland construction tenders, all underway right now. Aircraft, fixed wing and rotary wing, expanding our fleets. We did not have a program executive officer for unmanned systems before this reorganization, so we created that, we funded that. We've invested in counter UAS and unmanned air, surface, and underwater. We are preparing to secure FIFA sites and Sail 250 this summer, so there's some urgency to get that there. I would say the ability to obligate that level of funding hinges back to the three things I mentioned: the reorganization, how do we structure ourselves, total change in policies, and I'll highlight, we created these domains: surface, air, C5, shore, and robotics and automated systems, and put one person at the head of each domain is responsible for lifecycle management, whether it's acquisition or sustainment. So able to make good decisions about, do I invest in something new or do I keep a system running? And then a key part of it was we elevated functions that were buried deep in the organization before, including enterprise architecture, modeling, Office of Data and Analytics, AI, cybersecurity. So for the first time, we have resourced and staffed an integration layer above all the domains that can make good decisions that span, a ship and a C5 system, or a drone and a command center. It was very difficult before in the program of record silos to make good decisions across those. So some of that funding is applied at that layer, so we can build the digital threads, the modeling backbone in order to support all the programs. And then you asked for what's in the future. I would say maybe for this crowd, we are redesigning our command centers around the Coast Guard. Right now, at a Coast Guard command center, you may have 10 screens, and you have to, a human has to look across those 10 screens. The program is called Coastal Sentinel. It treats our command centers more like a network with sensors on them that we can apply across the nation, and less like siloed cameras and radars and data feeds. So just an example of, with that integration layer, you can think as a network with sensors as opposed to, we got money to replace this radar or this camera, and make good decisions across. You'll see a bunch of shore construction projects hitting this year. We're upgrading our training facilities, upgrading stations that had not had major maintenance for years. So really it's across all the domains, and leveraging not just our own contracting officers, but Army Corps of Engineers, NAVFAC, interagency agreements, using every lever we can to execute that funding.
So I want to ask you guys all a little bit about the defense industrial base and supply chains. Admiral Jacoby, I'll start with you. The Coast Guard is doing, I think, something pretty interesting right now. You guys are partnering a lot with foreign shipbuilders on some of these new cutters, with the idea that the first couple are going to be made abroad, and then these shipbuilders are going to come to the U.S. and stand up shipbuilding capacity here. So talk to me a little bit about what you guys are doing now to make sure that this runs smoothly in the future. Building ships is an incredibly complicated process, but I'm sure there's tons of opportunities, but also risk with that. So how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, so you may have seen in the news we awarded 3 contracts to 3 different shipbuilders for our medium icebreaker. Several hulls will be built in Finland, but we wrote an onshoring strategy for the president that said this overall program will bring work and jobs back to the United States, will create 2 new shipyards in the U.S., one in Texas and one either in Mississippi or Florida. And the Coast Guard traditionally doesn't go to Tier 1 shipyards. We've always kind of grown from the bottom up. So this will grow 2 new construction shipyards. And what we're doing right now to make sure that it is successful is we wrote into the original contracts, and we're definitizing right now things like all those shipbuilders work off a central digital model. So even though they're built in different shipyards, we have standardization and configuration management. All of the deliverables to the government will be digital. I'm shooting for as much SysML as I can manage. We will start putting requirements out in SysML, so contractors can propose. We can put it into our model and do evaluations that way instead of on paper. So, you know, it's early on. The shipbuilders are just getting to design and construction, but we will be finding ways to build, you know, Navy's been doing it for quite a while, distributed shipbuilding, to make that all either fit together or have a common equipment as much as possible, but a common configuration management across those.
And Pat and Vic, my question for you is sort of the same, but you guys will be attacking this at sort of opposite parts of the spectrum. So as you think about the supply chain and about the defense industrial base, where are we still seeing fragility, you know, especially as we kind of go deeper into the supply chain? And how would you grade industry's ability to scale and get up to a wartime footing if it needs to be?
You want me to take it? I'll take it.
Go ahead.
So the way we look at supply chains in general is, my boss like to say, rocks to rockets, right? Mine to foxhole, however you want to look at it. Very holistically, look at the value chain. So as you look, for example, I will stick with critical minerals, for example. Foundational, certain rare earths, light and heavies, antimony, germanium, gallium. You have to map that supply chain. You have to look at the different elements of that supply chain. And then you have to be able to determine whether those investments can be domestically, and geography matters, so in some instances you may have to go overseas, but it has to be very deliberate. It has to be targeted, and the fact that we have monies, as you said, to really get after it is important. The industry has stepped up. If you look at the number of the public awards we have given, and in many instances the department is now buying equity to help buttress, to attract and crowdsource private capital to be able to come in those very fragile areas that we need to get after. You mentioned shipbuilding, strategic, specialized steel, the type of welding wire that's required to get after those. In many instances, we have to work very closely with industry to be able to corner that market and really do future buys in order to get after. Part of the acquisition transformation strategy is exactly that, is doing the multi-year buys, doing predictable, to drive that predictable, stable demand into industry to ensure that we don't have this boom to bust, so to speak, that we're so notorious for. So there are a number of areas. Microelectronics continue to be a very fragile and critical area. And as we start to build this out in terms of scale, in terms of factories, one of the areas I will challenge industry to look at are the manufacturing equipment. Today, many of the manufacturing equipment comes from China. What are we doing about it? Right? How can we onshore that or friendshore that in a way that as we start to scale factories, we can equip those factories with whether it's American-made or friend-shored in a way that's secured and not compromised. Last thing I'll say, and I'll hand it off to Pat, is due diligence is very important. So our Global Investment and Economic Security team is looking at that 1260H, right, CCP list of those companies that the Chinese companies influence and shape. We're looking at that. If your supply chains, as a result of Section 805, is any way tied to China, you will not be able to do business with the Department of Defense in 27. So I just flagged that for us to start to look very deeply and ensure that those supply chains are decoupled.
Before I move over to Pat, I just want to ask really quickly, why is it so important that the people out here that are making weapons, weapon systems, that they're not using equipment that is made in China? That's something I've never heard of before. So why is that so important that they start to wean themselves off of Chinese equipment?
It's about influence and control, right? So let's say a factory that needs, I'll stick with critical minerals. The processing of those minerals, the specialized equipment that's needed for that. If suddenly China decides, I'm not going to ship to the United States, what happens? It brings you to your knees, right? So how do we mitigate that in a very meaningful and thoughtful way, right? There's some things that we'll have to work with our allies and partners, but there are many allies and partners that are ready to support us in that endeavor.
Pat, over to you.
Yeah, I think, if you think about what Vic said, and their orientation is really up and out for the department. And then I talked earlier about the continuum, and the continuum then comes to me for the down and in look for the department in terms of our ability to support, maintain the readiness of weapon systems and munitions. And so a lot of the things that Vic talks about, we are on the receiving end of. And so we think about, I think, when I think about supply chain and maintaining legacy platforms, in terms of fragility, I think in the context that we think about it is more, what suppliers do we have who can still make the things we need them to make? The continuing challenges that drives readiness is lack of manufacturers, diminishing sources of supply. A part is not economically viable to produce. Nobody wants to produce the part. We don't have the industrial base manufacturing the volume of legacy parts that we need to maintain our legacy platforms. And so we're doing a couple things with that. I mean, number one, leveraging data to be more deliberate about understanding be quantitative about the actual readiness drivers at a part level so that we can then aggregate the demand across the department and present to industry a more economically viable, palatable solution that they would want to manufacture in the quantities that make sense. So the fragility is really making sure, from our perspective, that we have the suppliers that can manufacture the parts that we need to make sure that we can maintain readiness. And then in terms of scaling, how do we think about quickly increasing capacity in the organic industrial base, which is foundational to readiness when we start to think about things like mobilizing, but understanding where our strengths and weaknesses in the supply chain are so that we have already thought through how we can leverage increased stock on hand to drive increased capacity.
So we have about 3 minutes left. I thought we could maybe do like a little 1-minute elevator pitch from each of you guys on what is it that you need. Like, we are right in the middle of, or we are just starting budget season on the Hill, NDAA season on the Hill. So, and both the HASC and SASC have announced that they're going to be looking at acquisition reform again within the NDAA. What would you tell them that you need? Is it money? Money for what? Is it changes in policies? What would make your job easier? Admiral, let's start with you.
Well, so first off, I'm always looking to maximize the special skills of the Coast Guard. I think people are used to, after a flood, us picking people off roofs or being the first people to respond to the key bridge collapse. So I think our special sauce is nimbleness, and applying that to acquisition has allowed us to execute 2,000% increase in funding in a record time. Part of that is you have seen many more RFIs from the Coast Guard out to industry. We have quadrupled the number of engagements, and we're being less shy about asking industry for their help. I will admit, in the past, we were hesitant, now we're not. So my one summary would be, we're going to be nimble, and we're going to be asking for industry to help us along the way.
Pat, over to you.
You know, I'll be honest. I think frankly, we're in a pretty good position. I mean, you know, do we have work to do? Absolutely. But generally speaking, I think we have the environment is conducive, particularly as we've talked about with industry, to collaborate in a productive way. I think that we have, you know, we've talked about the acquisition transformation strategy. I think that is a solid strategic document that guides the way ahead. You know, are there policy things probably on the margins that need to be changed? Of course, there always are, to refine and modify and improve. And I think, but you know, I think generally speaking, we're in a pretty good place. You know, going back to the tech data discussion, most likely have all of the authorities we need, and we are receiving significant congressional support. You know, in terms of, you know, if we need legislative changes to, you know, further empower us to do the things that we need to do. And so, frankly, I think that, you know, it's a conducive environment to, you know, for the department to take the reins and do what we need to do, really in collaboration with industry to drive readiness for the armed services.
Awesome. And Vic, close us out.
The Hill has been great to us. I don't know how many people can say that, but we have the authorities we need with Defense Production Act. We have the industrial base fund. We have directions that we need to go. It's just now making it happen. Back to multi-year funding, predictable, stable demand. If we have predictable, stable funding over time, we can get after the problems that we have. And we are getting after those problems today.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for being here with us today. This was an excellent talk. So thanks again.
All right. Nice job.